Hello everyone. This is Dr. Willow Ariala coming to talk to you about internal and external validity. We want to see how researchers set up their research studies so that they can control for various things. And two important considerations or concepts in research are internal and external validity. So internal validity has to do with how a researcher ensures that the independent variable, the thing that you're manipulating, is the only possible cause of the changes in the dependent variable, the thing that you're measuring. So internal validity has to do with how you set up your experiment internally, so the different ways you have your groups, your measurement tools, your apparatus, your environment settings, all of that stuff that's sort of internal to the study or research project. So the different things that researchers need to be aware of are things like history. So when you test or measure the participants more than once, their experience in between those measurements can affect the results, not the measurement tool itself. And so Smith&Davis cite a very extreme example of what happened in a study in 1940, but a more common example has to do with noise or laughter or other distractions that can occur during the study that may affect how participants respond to the thing that you're measuring. So oftentimes when we're talking about history, in most research we're talking about distractions, and that can be just about anything. Sometimes can have to do with how people are feeling and things like that. Another issue to consider is called maturation. It used to relate more to animal studies and the death of the animals, but more we're talking about short-term duration maturation effects, like people getting tired or hungry or bored. And so in an experiment you want to factor in how much time it takes to participate in the experiment. When I conducted interviews for my research, I had to consider how long the interviews would take and how many questions I asked, because after a certain amount of time people are going to get tired and they're going to want the interview to be over. So those sorts of things have to be considered. Testing effects. And so sometimes if people take a test, or if you have a pre-test or post-test and they're the same, these practice effects, just by virtue of taking the same thing again, or by practicing something, that can affect the validity of your variables. So the authors discuss the college testing exams, the ACT and SAT, and some of the norms that these exam businesses have established. And so typically when someone takes an exam, their score will usually, unless they really take drastic steps to improve their ability to retain information, their scores are going to go down a little bit or go up a little bit. Typically, don't expect extreme changes, but you still don't want testing or practice effects to be the main cause of the changes in the dependent variable. But they do note two important points about practice or testing effect, and one is that it's typically short-lived, and secondly that it's the improvement is expected to be small in the retesting. Then they discuss reactive measures, and so that has to do with how people kind of react or change their thinking, or basically they're attempting to answer in a way that they think the researchers want them to. So the authors discuss attitude questionnaires and how people can kind of figure out by asking certain questions or showing us a kind of film, or the experimenter themselves. All of those things and more can influence participants to react in a certain way, and that can affect their responses, and it's not the actual thing that you want to measure. And so they discuss, Smith and Davis discuss using non-reactive measures. So this requires being creative. How can we make it so that it's harder for participants to figure out exactly what we're wanting them to be assessed on, and how can we make ourselves less of a factor in the questions that we're asking or the things that we're trying to learn about. And so they talk about one-way mirrors, hidden cameras, microphones, naturalistic observation, deception, and other methods to reduce or eliminate reaction. Instrumentation or instrument decay. And so, again, this is kind of an older concept, but it's referring to how instruments, after you use them for a while, they need to be recalibrated. More in psychological research, we're talking about interraters, judges, observers, and coders. And so typically if you have more than one person who is assessing something in a study, then you want to use methods to check inter-rater reliability or intercoder reliability, or something to that effect, so that you can better ensure that the dependent variable is being assessed and the changes aren't due to differences in raters or observers or coders. Statistical regression. So basically this is that sometimes there will be extreme scores in a dependent variable, but on repeated testing that score will typically get closer to the mean or average. And this is a really important point, statistical regression. It's also called regression to the mean. So when you test somebody the first time, it may be an anomaly that they have an extreme score, a very high score, a very low score, and then when you retest, they're closer to the mean. And basically, as the authors describe, upon retesting, more than likely we will find their new scores are higher than the original scores. Why is this? So they're talking about a study program. Did the study course help the students improve their scores? It is certainly possible. However, isn't it also possible that regression to the mean is at work? When you score near the low end of a test possible score, there's not room to do much except improve. Sometimes it's difficult for people to see this point. They are convinced that the study course must be responsible for the improvement. So the point here is very important. People's high scores, if you retest them, they'll typically be closer to average or to the mean, and people's low scores, as the authors point out, typically will improve just by virtue of retaking them, and that people, if they've already scored low, they're probably going to get a little bit more correct on the next time around. So then you have to be sure that it's not the selection of participants that is affecting the dependent variable, rather than the actual dependent variable that you're trying to test. So statistical regression, or the regression to the mean, is something that you really have to watch out for, and it's kind of a subtle thing, and it may be hard to see if that's what's occurring, but it's something that definitely needs to be considered. Selection can be a threat to internal validity. We talk about threats to validity, internal and external. Threats. It's kind of a funny term, but that's what's talked about in research. So selection, when participants are chosen in a way that the groups are not equal, so there's something about them that makes them different enough that that's affecting the dependent variable being measured, not the actual measurement tool. And so you have to be careful about selecting the population, selecting the sample, how you randomly assign if you do, and things like that. The authors note, be careful not to confuse the selection problem with assignment of participants to groups. Selection typically refers to using participants who are already assigned to a particular group by virtue of their group membership. So they discuss how people who choose to watch a program or not watch a program probably differ in ways other than the knowledge of the program content. And so again, this is kind of a subtle thing. And it may be very difficult for us sometimes to know whether or not, or to even consider that there could be differences in participants who, for example, choose to watch a type of television show. You know, on the surface, it may not seem like there's much different about them, but there can be significant enough differences between people who choose to watch a particular type of TV show and others. Just like in online questionnaires, there can be very big differences in people who choose to participate in online studies or answer online questionnaires, because that's mostly what they are, compared to people who would not take those, participate in those kinds of studies. And there's no way to know with any kind of certainty that the group participating is different, how much they're different from the people who would not participate. And so online questionnaires are very, very, I would just be wary of their results and skeptical of the conclusions that the researchers draw from online studies. Mortality, so in human research, this refers to dropout, and that's typically what it's called, is dropouts. How many people drop out at a certain point, that can definitely affect the results. And this is, dropout rates dropout rates is a common and fairly problematic issue in research. So sometimes you have a big enough dropout, you can't really finish the research. You might be able to publish, very preliminary kinds of findings, but at a certain point, dropout rate, you can't proceed. I worked with a professor in grad school, and he was doing a study on EMDR, and he was talking to me about how many of his participants were dropping out, and that it was getting close to the point where he had to make a decision about whether or not he could continue with the study. So you have to be aware of dropout rates and when that can affect your dependent variable results. The authors ask a really good critical thinking question: how might previous dropout rates damage the internal validity of this experiment? On page 153, they're talking about using seniors and using freshmen, fresh people, and how they could be different, and also the sort of the dropout rate of college students in general. So that's an important point. If someone wants to study a dependent variable measure between freshmen and seniors in a college, then that is a highly selective group in both categories, and so the results are questionable. And then interactions with selection. So this is around the two groups in the study may show different maturation patterns. So they're talking about, for example, different age groups and the class differences. so language development may differ in classes, and so we're talking about lower class and middle class. So people would need to be aware of that. Researchers would need to be aware of that when they select their participants. And also, interaction effects can occur between selection and history or between selection and instrumentation. And so those are things to be aware of as well. And then diffusion or imitation of treatment. So that's where one group who's not receiving the treatment discovers that somebody else is receiving it, and they learn about that treatment, or whatever the independent measure is. And so there's like cross-contamination. And so when the control group or non-treatment group finds out about it and they start thinking about it or even utilizing it somehow, then you have diffusion or imitation of treatment, and that can reduce the dependent variable results. And then protecting internal validity. So what can you do about internal validity? So they mention two important approaches. Implement various control procedures that were discussed in chapters 6 and 7. And then also use standard research procedures called experimental designs, which will be discussed in future chapters in more detail. And then they say ask how important is internal validity. And they suggest it is the most important property of any experiment. If you do not concern yourself with the internal validity of your experiment, you are wasting your time. So it is very important to understand internal validity, so that when you're reading research studies, you can assess it, and to also plan for that in your own research. And then going on to the subject or topic of external validity. So when can you say that your results or the results of a study that you're reading apply to the general population or a particular population? So, if a study has a particular group of people in it, how much can you say their results apply to other groups of people, be it different age ranges, be it different races, ethnic groups, sexes, all of that. So that's about external validity. How much can you apply the results of one particular study to other groups or people or populations? So generally speaking, not every study, but a lot of studies, the goal is to say the results in this study can apply to be applied to people of lots of groups. And so I suppose it's sort of the gold standard to be able to generalize, but as noted at the end of this chapter, that's not always the goal. So that's also a consideration. So if a researcher has a goal of being able to generalize, then there are things that they must do in order to maintain external validity. So they talk about population, different kinds of generalization. So there are 3 kinds of generalization that researchers typically want to be able to ascertain from their study. And so you want to be able to determine from a research or in your own research study, can you generalize to a particular population or environment or time, and what measures did you take to ensure that? Smith&Davis discuss how the best way to control your study is to conduct it in a lab or similar setting. However, when you do that, you may not be able to generalize your results to the real world. So, what do you do to try to ensure more external validity than just doing laboratory studies? So they provide different methods for ensuring better external validity, and they discuss threats to external validity. Again, that word threat, but it's just a common research term. So threats to external validity. So one is interaction of testing and treatment. So both groups of participants are pre-tested and there's no control to determine whether or not the pre-test is having an effect. So there's no way to make sure that the retesting doesn't affect, or the pre-testing doesn't affect the results. And interaction of selection and treatment. So that was a threat to internal validity and also a threat to external validity that you need to watch for. Reactive arrangements. So these are conditions of an experimental setting that alter participants' behavior. So again, they're reacting to something. So you want to establish controls, but sometimes there are things that you can't have a whole lot of control over. But reactive arrangements, those are things that the participants are altering their behaviors due to the setting or situation that the participants are involved in the study. Demand characteristics. So these are sort of clues or body language, I guess you might say, that can influence how participants might react. So they do discuss, though, that it is impossible to design an experiment without demand characteristics, and that demand characteristics make generalization difficult because it is not clear whether participants are responding to an experiment's independent variable, demand characteristics, or both. So there's one perspective on demand characteristics. Is it impossible to remove them? That depends. Multiple treatment interference. So when people are exposed to more than one treatment, as in a repeated measures design. And then threats to external validity. Interesting discussion and an important discussion about how many research studies were conducted with the white rat. And the authors discuss two main concerns with external validity from all of these studies on white rats. So first, if you're interested in the behavior of subhumans or non-humans, generalizing from rats and pigeons to all other animals may be a stretch. That's very important. Second, if you're interested in generalizing from animal to human behavior, there are certainly closer approximations to humans than rats and pigeons. And so, and this is true for all research, can we reasonably generalize from one species to another? And unfortunately, that's done a lot, and often it should not be. So, so the authors are just pointing out that it may not be a good idea, and it probably often is not a good idea to say that what happens in a rat is going to be what happens in a human or any other species that you want to try to generalize to. And I think this is done a lot. You look at media headlines and studies are done on rats or some other animal, and they're generalizing the results to humans, and that may be inappropriate. And then they're talking about how many college students are utilized in research, and how that may be a problem for generalizing to other humans. Because we know that college students are a selected group. And then talking about how men were mostly used as research subjects, and their results were generalized to all people, including women, and there's been lots and lots of critique and additional studies done to try to ascertain whether or not the research conducted only on boys or men actually does apply to women, and sometimes it does, but sometimes it does not. And so the authors discuss how it's important to not generalize all findings done on men to women, and it's important to conduct research on women to learn more about women. And then also our language is important. So one thing that APA more requires is that we use non-sexist language in our writing. So it's not just a polite thing to write she or he, but it is a requirement to utilize non-sexist language and to be aware of why this is being required. So you want to take care in the language, because language does convey meaning and hidden meanings, and look at the reasonings behind using certain words, and why APA is saying sexist language is inappropriate, and to know more about sexist language. And then the authors discuss how much research has been done on mostly Caucasians and the problems that can cause when we generalize results done on Caucasians to other groups. So we have to be cautious about doing that. And then how much research is conducted on American humans, and whether or not it's appropriate to generalize those results to non-Americans or people from other countries. And then an important discussion by Smith&Davis on whether or not external validity is always necessary, and it's not. So they raise a really good question and really important information to consider. And so it is not always the goal of every single research study to generalize to all humans. And in fact, that's probably not even a realistic thing to do. I think it's more realistic to conduct studies on people and generalize to similar groups, be it age range, be it ethnic group or sex or whatever that is, and then replicate the studies with extension to other groups to see if the results do apply and can be generalized to other groups. But important discussion on page 167 that generalization is not always intended or not always meaningful. And so as they discuss whether or not external validity can or should be done or required depends on the conclusion that the researchers draw. So if researchers are saying that my results apply to all humans, is that accurate? And you have to look at internal validity as well as external validity to ascertain for yourself whether or not you think what they're saying their results are generalizable to is accurate. And so there are other reasons to conduct research that don't involve trying to predict behavior in the real world. And so we might want to find out whether or not something can happen. So is this thing, does it occur? So an initial research study may just want to find out, can something happen or does something happen in people at all? And so you might want to look at that first and then do more generalizable research. Second, we may be predicting from the real world to the lab. So we want to see if something that occurs in the real world can be replicated in the lab. Can we demonstrate that something occurs in a lab's natural setting? Then the validity may actually be strengthened. So if we can replicate something that we see in the real world in a lab, then maybe that gives it more validity. And then we may be studying phenomena in a lab that don't even have a real world analogy, which it would have been helpful if they provided examples, but so the bottom line is research results aren't always intended to be generalizable, and nor should they always be generalized. And so one needs to take care in one's own research as well as evaluating other people's research to see if they are generalizing appropriately. And so the authors mentioned two main things to avoid external validity problems. They do make an important comment. They say you might be old and gray before you completed an experiment that was had perfect external validity. And so it's very true. It's very difficult to maintain every single aspect of external validity and have perfect research results. It's probably next to impossible. So, so mostly you want to maximize your ability to achieve external validity if that is appropriate to your research question, and it may not be. And then there are two important things that people can do to increase external validity, and one is replication. So if somebody or you replicates a study and you get similar or the same results, then you can have more confidence in your results and are more able to generalize it. And then replication with extension, so that is redoing the study but with a slightly different or very different population. And so again, if you get similar or same results, then you can have more confidence in your results as well as generalizability. So finally they say the conclusion about external validity. We believe it is unrealistic to expect every or any experiment to be applicable to the entire world of animals or people. That is probably a myth that exists only in fairy tales. Nonetheless, we also believe that you should strive to make your experiment as externally valid as possible. When you have choices, offer the choices that will increase the external validity of your findings, which I would agree with. So we want to take measures to increase both internal and external validity, and some of those are discussed in Smith&Davis, and you'll learn some more as you continue to learn about research and if you do your own research study. But it helps to have a good understanding of internal and external validity when you're reading other people's research as well, so that you can be responsible consumers. All right, thank you for your time and attention. Bye.